Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into a core area of med-surg problems affecting the oral cavity and the esophagus.
Yeah, these might seem basic, but they hit right at fundamental functions like, eating and even breathing.
Exactly. So let's break it down.
Right. Our mission really is to pull out the absolute must-know info from your sources. We'll be focusing on two huge concepts: tissue integrity and nutrition.
Okay, tissue integrity and nutrition.
And as we talk, you'll see how they constantly connect to other vital ideas like managing pain and, probably the most critical, ensuring gas exchange, basically, keeping the airways safe.
Makes sense. So let's frame this, starting with the mouth, maybe. For tissue integrity, the classic example is stomatitis, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Simple inflammation of the lining of the mouth. We often call them canker sores, but it means painful ulcers, a break in that protective barrier.
And then looking down towards the esophagus, there's GERD, Gastroesophageal Reflux Disease. That's the chronic issue, isn't it? Where stomach contents keep flowing backward.
Precisely. And that directly threatens the tissue integrity of the esophagus itself. It's a constant chemical irritation.
Before we dive deeper, who are the folks most at risk here? The sources seem to point to specific groups.
They do. You really need to be thinking about patients who are immunocompromised. Older adults are a big one, people in long-term care or institutions, and those with developmental delays.
Why those groups specifically?
It often comes down to things like medication side effects, maybe difficulties with oral hygiene, or just a naturally weaker immune response, especially in older adults.
Okay, so let's focus on stomatitis first. The sources mention primary versus secondary types.
Yeah, primary is like your typical aphthous stomatitis, the non-infectious canker sores.
Mhm.
But secondary, that's usually infection taking advantage of a weakened state.
And the big one for secondary?
Overwhelmingly, it's candidiasis, thrush, caused by the fungus Candida albicans. It's a major signal of immune issues.
Where do we see it most often?
You see it a lot in patients on long-term broad-spectrum antibiotics because their normal protective mouth bacteria get wiped out.
Okay.
Definitely in older adults,
Mhm.
partly due to that natural immune decline we mentioned, but also because of a really common problem: xerostomia.
Severe dry mouth.
Exactly, severe dry mouth, often medication-induced. Without enough saliva, that protective environment is just gone, making fungal infections much easier.
And beyond infections, what else triggers those painful mouth ulcers?
Oh, it can be complex. Deficiencies are a big one. B vitamins like folate or minerals like zinc, iron. Also, certain foods can be triggers for some people: coffee, cheese, citrus fruits, even gluten. It varies a lot.
Okay, so once someone has stomatitis, what's the immediate nursing safety concern?
Pain is obvious, but the real danger sign is dysphagia, difficulty swallowing.
Because of the swelling and the pain.
Yes, it makes swallowing incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, and that's where the risk escalates really quickly.
How quickly are we talking? Is it gradual or sudden?
It can become a crisis pretty fast, especially if the inflammation is severe or the ulcers are widespread. Dysphagia puts the patient at immediate risk for choking, aspirating food or fluid into the lungs.
Leading to aspiration pneumonia?
Correct. And significant malnutrition if they just can't eat.
Is there a quick way to screen for that risk?
Yeah, the sources give us the PASS acronym. It's a handy four-step check. P, is it probable the patient has swallowing difficulty? A, account for any history. Have they had issues before? S, screen for symptoms. Are they drooling, coughing when they drink, pocketing food?
And the final S.
Get an immediate SLP referral. Speech-language pathologists, they're the experts in swallowing assessment and therapy.
Okay, so for interventions, it sounds like careful oral hygiene is paramount.
Absolutely. Meticulous care. But the sources are really clear on what not to do.
Like what?
Avoid those commercial mouthwashes with alcohol. They sting and dry things out more. And definitely skip the lemon glycerin swabs. They seem refreshing, but they're actually irritating to damaged tissue.
So what should we use?
Best practice is frequent rinsing. Warm saline, just salt and water, or a sodium bicarbonate solution, baking soda mixed with water, gentle and cleansing.
And if it's candidiasis?
Then we use antifungals like clotrimazole troches. Those are like lozenges they dissolve in the mouth, or nystatin suspension, which is usually switched around and then spit out.
What about managing the pain? Diet changes.
Yes, diet is key. Cool or cold liquids can be very soothing. Avoid anything hard, spicy, or acidic that will just aggravate the ulcers. Think bland, soft foods.
And for really bad pain, I know sometimes stronger swish and spit meds are used.
Right, you might see things like diphenhydramine liquid or sometimes viscous lidocaine, but that lidocaine, that comes with a huge safety warning. a drug alert.
Why is that? It numbs the pain, right?
It does. It works very well, but it numbs everything. It's a topical anesthetic, so the patient loses all sensation in their mouth and throat
Okay. So why is losing sensation so dangerous?
because it knocks out their protective reflexes. The gag reflex, the cough reflex, they're gone temporarily. This massively increases the risk of aspiration food or liquid going down the wrong way.
Ah, I see.
And another big one, if they try to drink something hot while numb, they won't feel the temperature. They could get a really severe burn inside their mouth or throat.
Wow. So patient education is absolutely critical before giving that.
Non-negotiable. They have to understand those risks.
Okay, that focus on tissue breakdown in the mouth transitions us nicely down to the esophagus and GERD. Stomatitis is damage. GERD is more about function failing.
Exactly. It's about the lower esophageal sphincter, the LES, that valve at the bottom of the esophagus.
Yeah.
When it's compromised, it doesn't seal properly.
And stomach contents flow back up. Regurgitation.
Right. And that chronic backward flow of acid damages the esophageal lining. That's a tissue integrity issue again. And it also impacts nutrition because eating becomes painful or difficult.
What makes that LES function poorly? What are the risk factors?
Being overweight or having obesity is a major one. Increased abdominal pressure basically squeezes the stomach and forces contents upward. Also, H. pylori infection can play a role.
How does H. pylori connect?
It contributes to gastritis and can slow down gastric emptying, meaning food sits in the stomach longer, increasing the chance of reflux.
So the classic symptoms are heartburn, dyspepsia, and that regurgitation feeling.
Yes. And importantly, the symptoms typically get worse when the patient bends over or lies down, just due to gravity.
The sources mention something called water brash. What's that?
Yeah, it's a weird one. It's this sudden filling of the mouth with saliva hypersecretion. But like typical regurgitation, it doesn't usually have that sour, bitter taste of stomach acid. It's just fluid, kind of unpleasant.
And we have to remember, severe GERD pain can sometimes feel like heart pain, right?
Absolutely critical point. It can mimic cardiac pain very closely. So if a patient comes in with chest pain, you rule out cardiac causes, but you also need to consider GERD. And importantly, address the anxiety that comes with thinking you're having a heart attack. Psychosocial assessment is key there.
Okay, let's talk long-term problems. Chronic acid exposure leads to reflux esophagitis.
Yes, inflammation of the esophagus. And this is where it gets really serious from a long-term perspective. During the healing process from that constant acid burn, the normal cells lining the esophagus, squamous cells, can get replaced by a different type of cell, columnar cells.
That sounds like the body trying to adapt.
It is,
Yeah.
in a way. It's trying to create a tougher lining. But this replacement tissue, called Barrett's epithelium, is considered premalignant.
Precancerous.
Exactly. It significantly increases the risk of developing esophageal cancer down the road. That's a huge clinical red flag.
And scarring can also cause problems.
Yes. Repeated inflammation and healing can lead to scar tissue formation, causing an esophageal stricture, which is a narrowing of the esophagus, making swallowing difficult again.
So managing GERD is crucial to prevent these things. Since it's chronic, lifestyle and education must be huge.
Foundational. Patients need to understand this isn't usually a quick fix. Nutrition is a cornerstone. Eating smaller, more frequent meals like 4 to 6 small ones a day.
Instead of 3 large ones.
Right, and absolutely crucial. Avoid eating for at least 3 hours before going to bed. Lying down with a full stomach is asking for reflux.
What about specific foods to avoid?
There are foods known to relax that LES, making reflux easier. Think peppermint, chocolate, fatty foods, caffeine, alcohol, carbonated drinks.
And also things that directly irritate the esophagus.
Yes, like spicy foods, tomato-based products, orange juice, anything acidic. Patients often learn their own specific triggers too.
Now, linking back to safety and gas exchange, you mentioned not eating before bed. How should people with GERD sleep?
This is a really important safety point, especially for preventing aspiration overnight. Just stacking up pillows usually isn't enough. You need to elevate the entire head of the bed.
How?
Using blocks under the bedposts at the head end, or using a wedge pillow that elevates the whole upper body. Gravity then helps keep stomach contents down.
Okay. What about medications?
The mainstays are antacids for quick relief, H2 blockers, and the most powerful ones, proton pump inhibitors, PPIs.
But there's a catch with long-term PPI use, especially in older adults.
Yes, another important safety consideration. Research has shown a link between long-term chronic PPI use and an increased risk of hip fractures in older adults.
Why is that? What's the mechanism?
The thinking is that by reducing stomach acid so significantly for long periods, PPIs can interfere with the body's ability to absorb calcium.
And calcium is vital for bone strength.
Exactly. So it's not just a side effect, it's a potential metabolic consequence that needs monitoring and consideration, especially in older patients who are already at higher risk for osteoporosis and fractures.
For patients who don't respond well to lifestyle changes and meds, there are more advanced options.
Yes, endoscopic procedures like the Stretta procedure, which uses radiofrequency energy to kind of tighten the LES area. And then there's the LINX reflux management system.
What's that?
It's basically a small ring of magnetic beads placed surgically around the outside of the LES. The magnets help keep the sphincter closed to prevent reflux, but they're weak enough to open when the person swallows.
Magnets. That sounds like it might cause issues with certain medical tests.
Huge safety alert here.
Yeah.
Critical. Patients with LINX devices, especially older versions, must never undergo an MRI scan.
Yeah.
The powerful magnets in the MRI machine could interact with the device magnets, potentially causing serious internal injury.
Wow.
They absolutely must inform every single healthcare provider about the LINX device before any imaging, especially MRI, is even considered.
That LINX warning really underscores the complexities. Okay, let's shift back up to the oral cavity briefly, focusing on tumors and cancer. What are the early warning signs we should be looking for?
There are two main premalignant lesions to know. Leukoplakia, those are thickened white patches that are firmly stuck on, often linked to tobacco use.
White patches. Yeah.
And then erythroplakia, which is a velvety red patch. Erythroplakia actually carries a higher risk of becoming cancerous than leukoplakia.
So red is often more concerning than white here.
Generally, yes. But really, any lesion in the mouth, red, white, raised, eroded, or even just a lump that doesn't heal within 2 weeks needs immediate evaluation. That's the key time frame. Don't wait.
Who's most at risk for oral cancer?
Tobacco use, heavy alcohol consumption are the big ones.
Yeah.
Also, HPV infection is increasingly recognized as a factor. Sun exposure for lip cancer. And certain occupational exposures, like to PAH's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons.
If someone does need surgery for oral cancer, maybe removal of part of the tongue, glossectomy, or jaw, mandibulectomy, or a neck dissection, what's the absolute top priority post-op?
Without a doubt, it's airway maintenance. That links directly back to our gas exchange concept. Surgery in the mouth and neck region carries a high risk of swelling and bleeding that can compromise the airway.
So constant monitoring, suction available, maybe a temporary tracheostomy sometimes?
Absolutely. Aspiration precautions are essential. Airway management is number one.
Okay, moving down again, let's touch on hiatal hernias. That's when part of the stomach pushes up through the diaphragm, right?
Correct. Through the esophageal hiatus, that opening in the diaphragm where the esophagus passes.
Are there different types?
Yes. The most common is type I, the sliding hernia. The junction between the esophagus and stomach, and part of the stomach itself, slide up into the chest, often when the person lies down. This type is very often associated with GERD.
And the other type?
Types 2 through 4 are called paraesophageal or rolling hernias. Here, the stomach junction stays put, but part of the stomach rolls up alongside the esophagus into the chest. These are less common, but actually more dangerous.
Why more dangerous?
Because the part of the stomach that herniates up can get trapped, twisted, volvulus, obstructed, or even lose its blood supply to strangulation. These are surgical emergencies.
So surgery might be needed for severe GERD or these rolling hernias. What's the common procedure?
It's often a fundoplication. The surgeon wraps the top part of the stomach, the fundus, around the lower end of the esophagus.
Kind of like creating a new reinforced valve?
Exactly. It tightens the LES area to prevent reflux. The standard approach these days is usually the laparoscopic Nissen fundoplication, or LNF, less invasive.
Okay. Post-op care after any esophageal surgery, whether it's for hernia, GERD, or even cancer resection.
Yeah.
What are the key nursing priorities?
Again, number one is preventing respiratory complications. Gas exchange. Keep the head of the bed elevated at least 30 degrees. Get the patient moving early ambulation. Encourage deep breathing and coughing, but make sure they splint their incision for support.
Now, many of these patients will come back from surgery with a nasogastric tube, an NG tube. Is there anything special we need to know about managing that?
Yes. This is a huge action alert, a critical safety point. After esophageal surgery, that NG tube is often large bore, and it's there specifically to decompress the stomach, to keep pressure off the fresh surgical site or anastomosis.
So we need to make sure it's working, draining properly.
Right. Monitor the output, check for patency. But, and this is vital, do not irrigate or reposition that NG tube unless you have a specific order from the surgeon.
Wait, why not? Normally we might flush an NG tube if it seems clogged.
Because you could inadvertently push the tube through the suture line, disrupt the fundoplication wrap, or even perforate the esophagus or stomach. The surgical site is incredibly delicate right after surgery. Messing with the tube without explicit orders is incredibly risky.
Got it. That's a really important distinction.
It leads right into another critical rescue situation we have to watch for. Signs of a leak from where they join the tissues back together, and an anastomotic leak or infection spreading in the chest cavity, mediastinitis.
Life-threatening complications. What are the signs?
Look for fever, maybe fluid accumulating around the incision, and importantly, signs of early shock, a rapid heart rate, tachycardia, and rapid breathing tachypnea. Maybe increasing chest pain or shortness of breath. Any of those need immediate reporting. It's a surgical emergency.
Okay, shifting to malignant esophageal tumors. The sources say these are often caught late.
Unfortunately, yes. Early symptoms are often vague or absent. By the time patients usually seek help, the main symptom is often persistent, progressive dysphagia, difficulty swallowing that gets worse over time.
And significant weight loss often goes with that?
Yes, often quite dramatic, unplanned weight loss, the sources mention sometimes over 20 pounds. That points to a serious problem of getting nutrition down.
So nutrition support is vital again.
Absolutely essential. They might need semi-soft foods, thickened liquids. Collaboration with the SLP for swallowing therapy is key. And don't forget the psychosocial aspect.
How so?
A diagnosis like esophageal cancer, especially late stage, carries a massive emotional burden, anxiety, depression. They're incredibly common and need to be addressed as part of holistic care.
Right. Okay, just to quickly cover the last couple of points mentioned. Sialadenitis.
Inflammation of a salivary gland, often bacterial or viral. Good oral hygiene is the best prevention. If it happens, treatment involves hydration, warm compresses, maybe gland massage, and antibiotics if it's bacterial. Also worth noting, radiation therapy to the head and neck can damage salivary glands, causing chronic xerostomia.
That dry mouth issue again?
Yes. And finally, esophageal trauma.
How does that happen?
Usually from swallowing caustic substances, strong acids, or even worse, alkaline agents like drain cleaner, which cause rapid, deep burns. Can also happen from severe, forceful vomiting, like Borheis syndrome, or swallowing foreign objects.
What's the immediate care there?
Airway first, always. Then, keep the patient NPO nothing by mouth to let the esophagus rest. They'll likely need nutritional support via TPN, broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent infection, and often high-dose corticosteroids are considered to try and reduce inflammation and prevent stricture formation later on. #tag outro. Pulling all that together, we really navigated through those core concepts. We saw how tissue integrity was central to stomatitis and GERD complications like Barrett's, and how crucial nutrition support is, whether it's managing GERD triggers or dealing with swallowing difficulties from cancer or surgery.
Yeah, and woven through all of it were those constant priorities of managing pain and protecting gas exchange, especially airway safety after oral or esophageal procedures.
Exactly. It provides a solid framework for thinking about these patients.
So if you had to boil it down to one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be? It's more than just knowing the definitions, right?
I think it really boils down to clinical judgment and proactive identification of risk. It's about seeing that older patient on a PPI and thinking about fracture risk. It's about recognizing the subtle signs of dysphagia and acting quickly. It's screening that long-term smoker for oral lesions, even if they have no complaints.
So it's translating that knowledge into anticipating problems and intervening early.
Precisely. That's where knowing this stuff really makes a difference in patient outcomes. That shift from just knowing facts to applying them critically at the bedside.
That's a great point to end on, turning knowledge into life-saving action. We really appreciate you learning with us in this rapid review of essential knowledge. Thanks for tuning into the deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.